The Jury's Dilemma. Chapter 1. The Summons. Charles Foster stood in the doorway of his modest two-story house, a thick envelope trembling in his hand. The heavy seal of the state court was unmistakable, its authority almost palpable through the paper. He had hoped this day would never come. Jury duty wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an intrusion into his carefully constructed life. But what he didn't realize, as he slid his finger under the flap and ripped it open, was that this summons was unlike any other. Inside, there were the usual instructions. Report to the courthouse next Monday, serve until dismissed, and uphold the solemn duty of justice. But a handwritten note caught his attention, tucked in with the official documents. His breath hitched as he read it. Do your part and no one gets hurt. Vote guilty. A chill ran down Charles's spine. He looked around his quiet street, half expecting to see someone watching, but the neighborhood was still. The children next door played in their front yard, and the only sound was the distant hum of a lawnmower. His heart pounded in his chest as the reality of the situation set in. He wasn't just being called to serve on any trial. This was a message from someone who knew he would be on that jury. Someone who knew the stakes and who wasn't afraid to use fear to influence the outcome. Charles walked inside, locking the door behind him, as if that thin barrier could protect him from the unseen menace. He read the note again. Vote guilty. The words danced in his mind, mixing with the anxiety that now clung to him like a second skin. He tossed the note into the trash, but it was too late. The fear was already there, burrowing deep into his thoughts. Who was behind this, and what exactly did they want from him? The rest of the week passed in a blur. Charles tried to convince himself that it was some kind of prank, a hoax designed to mess with him. But the feeling of being watched persisted, a shadow at the edge of his consciousness. Every time he glanced at his phone, every time he heard a car pull up outside, his stomach twisted into knots. The note had come from someone who had power over him, and that power was like a noose tightening with each passing day. By Sunday evening, Charles had reached his breaking point. He poured himself a drink, staring at the empty seat across the table where his wife once sat. Emily had left him years ago, citing his paranoia and inability to handle stress. She had been right about one thing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. When Monday morning arrived, he felt as if he were walking into a nightmare. The courthouse loomed over him, a symbol of justice and truth. Yet Charles knew the truth was murkier than it appeared. He joined the rest of the jury pool, sitting in the waiting room, trying to keep his face calm, trying not to imagine who among them might be involved in this dark scheme. Could the person who wrote the note be watching him right now? Was he already under their thumb? Finally, his name was called. Charles Foster, please report to Courtroom 3. The trial was about to begin. What do you think Charles should do next? Stay tuned for the shocking twists to come. Don't miss out. Subscribe and share to follow the suspenseful unraveling of the jury's dilemma. Chapter 2. The trial begins. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and made you feel uneasy. Charles took his seat in the jury box, his eyes scanning the room. The defendant, a man named Paul Avery, sat at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He looked calm, almost resigned, as if he already knew how this would end. Charles wondered if Avery had any idea what was going on behind the scenes, or if he was as much a pawn as Charles was. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, gave her instructions, reminding the jury of their solemn duty. But Charles's mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the note in his head. Do your part, and no one gets hurt. The prosecution began its opening statement. The lead prosecutor, Sarah Wellington, was sharp, articulate, and methodical. She laid out the case with chilling clarity. Avery had been accused of brutally assaulting a young woman in her apartment building. The evidence was circumstantial, but Wellington promised the jury that they would soon see how it all connected. Charles could feel his pulse quicken. He had read the case summary beforehand, and even then, something didn't feel right. There were gaps in the timeline, pieces of evidence that seemed too convenient. And now, with the threat looming over him, every detail took on new weight. The defense attorney, Richard Blackwell, stood to deliver his opening remarks. He was an older man, with silver hair and a calm demeanor that belied his sharp legal mind. Blackwell argued that the case against Avery was weak, that the prosecution had rushed to judgment without fully exploring other suspects. He pointed out the lack of physical evidence linking Avery to the crime scene. As he spoke, Charles noticed how the defendant kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the jury. Charles could almost feel the walls closing in around him. Every word spoken in that courtroom felt like a countdown ticking toward an inevitable conclusion. And the worst part was that he didn't even know who he was up against. Was it someone in the courtroom? Was it one of the other jurors? The first witness was called to the stand, a neighbor who had allegedly seen Avery near the victim's apartment the night of the assault. She was nervous, her eyes darting around the courtroom as she recounted her testimony. Charles watched her closely, trying to gauge whether she was telling the truth or if she, too, was being manipulated. By the end of the day, his head was spinning. The weight of the note pressed heavily on his shoulders, and every decision, every observation he made felt like it could tip the scales toward disaster. As the jury was dismissed for the evening, Charles couldn't help but feel that someone was watching him. Someone who knew what he had to do. But could he really condemn a man on someone else's orders? What secrets lie beneath the surface of this trial? Find out in the next chapter. Be sure to subscribe and share to follow this gripping story as it unfolds. Chapter 3. The Threat. Charles walked out of the courthouse with a sense of unease that clung to him like the cold October air. The streets were busy with the usual hum of city life. Cars honking, people rushing by. But for Charles, the world had narrowed to a point of suffocating pressure. He couldn't stop thinking about the note. As he approached his car, parked a few blocks away from the courthouse, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He froze, his hand hesitating before pulling it out. A new message flashed on the screen from an unknown number. "You're doing well so far. Remember, guilty." His heart dropped. Charles looked around, scanning the faces of passers-by, trying to spot anyone paying too much attention to him. But everyone seemed to be caught up in their own worlds, oblivious to his silent panic. He quickly shoved the phone back into his pocket, his mind racing. Whoever sent the message was watching him, that much was clear. But from where? How could they know what was happening inside the courthouse? And more importantly, what would they do if he didn't comply? The question gnawed at him as he drove home, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each passing minute. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his mind was a storm of anxiety. He hadn't even noticed the black sedan parked 2 houses down, its windows tinted and its engine idling. Later that evening, Charles sat at his kitchen table, the day's events replaying in his head. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, hoping to quiet the storm in his mind, but the alcohol did little to dull the fear. His thoughts were a maze of dead ends, each more terrifying than the last. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "No mistakes tomorrow. We're watching." The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Charles stared at the shards, his pulse racing, the room spinning around him. The threat was no longer subtle. Whoever they were, they meant business. He stumbled to the living room, locking every door, pulling the blinds closed, as if that could keep the fear out. But there was no escaping it now. It had followed him home, a dark presence hovering just out of sight. Charles knew he had a choice to make. He could either give in to the demands of these shadowy figures and vote guilty, condemning Paul Avery to a fate he might not deserve, or he could defy them. But what would happen if he did? Would they come after him? His family? Suddenly, the phone rang. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call. The screen flashed unknown caller. Charles stared at it, his hand trembling as he picked it up and pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello?" A voice on the other end, calm and steady. "Yes, Charles, who is this?" "It's Avery. Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm fine. What's the matter?" low and menacing, sent a chill down his spine. "Don't test us, Charles. You know what you have to do. Vote guilty, or you'll regret it." Before he could respond, the line went dead. He stood there in the darkened room, the silence heavy around him. His thoughts were a jumble of fear, guilt, and desperation. What could he do? Who could he turn to? The police? No, there was no proof, just messages from an untraceable number and a voice that could be anyone. Charles sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. He felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in. The weight of the decision was crushing him. And yet, deep down, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the only one on trial here. Will Charles follow the mysterious orders, or will he defy the threat? The stakes are getting higher. Stay tuned to find out what happens next. Be sure to subscribe and share to stay on the edge of your seat with the jury's dilemma. Chapter 4. The Confession. The next morning, Charles arrived at the courthouse with a sense of dread that hung over him like a dark cloud. He hadn't slept much, and the weight of the previous night's threats still lingered in his mind. Every step felt heavier, every glance over his shoulder more paranoid. The trial resumed with the prosecution calling its next witness, a forensic expert who presented DNA evidence. The expert explained how traces of the victim's blood had been found on Paul Avery's clothes. The jury listened intently, but Charles felt detached, as if the trial were happening in some distant world. His mind kept wandering back to the messages, the phone call, and the unseen eyes watching his every move. It wasn't until the defense called their witness that something broke through Charles's fog of fear. A woman stepped to the stand, Ana Garcia, a co-worker of the victim. She was visibly nervous, her hands clutching the sides of the witness stand as she glanced over at Paul Avery, her face pale. Blackwell, the defense attorney, approached her carefully, his tone gentle. "Miss Garcia," he began, "can you tell the court where you were the night of the attack?" Anna hesitated, her eyes flickering to the prosecution's table before finally meeting Blackwell's gaze. I was at home," she stammered. "And did you see anything unusual in the days leading up to the incident?" Blackwell pressed. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Avery again, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, sensing something was about to break. "What did you see, Miss Garcia?" Blackwell asked, his voice calm but insistent. Anna looked down at her hands, her knuckles white as she gripped the stand. "I saw someone following her." The prosecution quickly objected, but the damage was already done. Anna's words hung in the air, and Charles could feel the shift in the room. He leaned forward in his seat, for the first time since the trial began, truly focused on what was happening. Blackwell turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to discuss this new testimony." The judge agreed, and the jury was escorted out of the room, leaving Charles reeling. Ana Garcia's testimony had opened a door, one that could potentially lead to the truth. But even as hope flickered in the back of his mind, the threat still loomed over him like a shadow. In the hallway, Charles glanced at his phone. No new messages, no calls. But he knew it was only a matter of time before the unseen figures behind the threats would make themselves known again. The jury returned to the deliberation room, where conversations buzzed around him. Some of the jurors were already leaning toward a guilty verdict, while others expressed doubt after Anna's testimony. But Charles remained silent, his mind racing. Could he really go along with the threat and vote guilty, or was there still a way out? Is Charles about to uncover the truth, or will the threat push him to the brink? Don't miss the next thrilling chapter of the jury's dilemma. Subscribe and share to stay on the edge of your seat. Chapter 5. The Offer. Charles sat at the small table in the deliberation room, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. The other jurors were deep in conversation, debating the weight of the evidence they had heard so far. But for Charles, the real trial wasn't happening inside the courtroom. It was the one playing out in his mind, as the threats he had received echoed relentlessly. Suddenly, A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Jason, one of the other jurors, leaning toward him with a concerned expression. "You okay, man? You've been quiet this whole time." Charles forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." Jason nodded, but Charles could see the doubt in his eyes. He had been acting strange, he knew that. But how could he explain the invisible pressure crushing him? How could he tell anyone about the threats without putting himself in even more danger? The door to the deliberation room creaked open, and a court officer stepped in. "We'll be taking a short recess. You're free to leave for lunch." Charles exhaled, grateful for the break. He quickly gathered his things and made his way out of the courthouse, feeling the walls of the building close in behind him like a prison. He had just stepped outside, his mind still racing, when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and a man in a dark suit leaned out. His face was stern, with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to dissect Charles with a single glance. "Get in," the man said, his voice low but commanding. Charles froze, his heart pounding. He looked around, but the sidewalk was empty. No one to witness what was happening. The man's gaze remained fixed on him, waiting for Charles to make a move. "Who are you?" Charles asked, his voice trembling. "I'm someone who can make your life very difficult or very easy. Depends on your next decision." Charles hesitated, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He couldn't afford to make the wrong choice. With a shaky breath, he climbed into the car. The door clicked shut, and the car pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly through the city streets. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Charles kept his hands clenched in his lap, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Was he the one behind the threats? The man leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Charles's. "I'm sure you've figured out by now that you're in a unique position. The trial you're part of, it's important. More important than you realize." Charles swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Why me? Why are you targeting me?" A thin smile crossed the man's face. "Because you're the kind of man who understands consequences. We need you to make sure that Avery goes to prison. If he walks, certain interests will suffer." Charles felt a knot form in his stomach. "And if I don't?" The man's smile vanished. "Let's just say your life will get complicated. Very quickly." The silence in the car was suffocating. Charles could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream, to tell the man that this wasn't fair, that he couldn't possibly make a decision like this. But deep down, he knew the man didn't care. This was about power, control. And Charles was just another piece on the board. After what felt like an eternity, the car came to a stop. The man handed Charles a business card with nothing but a number printed on it. "Call if you need any encouragement. Just remember, we're watching." Without another word, the man opened the door and nodded for Charles to get out. Charles stepped onto the sidewalk, the weight of the card in his hand feeling like a lead brick. The car pulled away, disappearing into the flow of traffic as if it had never been there. Charles stood there for a moment, his mind numb. The threat was real. The man, whoever he was, had made it clear. But now there was something more, an offer, a way to make the pressure disappear. All he had to do was comply. Vote guilty. As Charles walked back to the courthouse, the business card seemed to burn a hole in his pocket. He could feel its presence with every step, a constant reminder that his freedom, his safety, depended on the choice he made in that jury box. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just his life on the line. Paul Avery's future hung in the balance, too, and Charles had to decide how far he was willing to go to save himself. What will Charles choose? The stakes are higher than ever, and the pressure is mounting. Don't miss the next chapter of the jury's dilemma. Subscribe and share to follow this tense, thrilling story to its conclusion. Chapter 6. The verdict. The deliberation room was tense. The jurors sat around the long table, their faces a mixture of fatigue and uncertainty. The trial had stretched on longer than anyone expected, and now, after days of testimony, they were tasked with deciding Paul Avery's fate. Charles sat at the far end of the table, his hands folded in front of him, the business card still tucked away in his pocket. He could feel it pressing against his thigh, a constant reminder of the offer the man had made. But now, as the time to vote approached, Charles's mind was in turmoil. The other jurors were discussing the evidence, going back and forth about Avery's guilt or innocence. Some were convinced that Avery was the attacker, citing the DNA evidence and the testimony of the witnesses. Others, however, were more cautious, pointing out the gaps in the timeline and the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. Jason, the juror who had checked on Charles earlier, spoke up. "Look, the evidence is there, but something doesn't sit right with me. There's a lot of doubt in this case." Several jurors nodded in agreement. Charles could feel the tide turning, the momentum shifting away from a guilty verdict. But the man's voice echoed in his mind, "Vote guilty, or you'll regret it." He stared at the table, the weight of his decision crushing him. If he voted guilty, he would be safe. His life would go back to normal. But it would mean condemning a man who might be innocent, a man who could spend the rest of his life in prison because of a decision made under threat. On the other hand, if he voted not guilty, defying the threat, his own life would spiral into chaos. He had no doubt that the man in the black car would make good on his promise. Charles could only imagine the consequences. Jason turned to Charles. "What do you think? You've been quiet." Charles looked up, meeting Jason's eyes. The room fell silent as the jurors waited for his response. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy. He glanced around the table at the faces of his fellow jurors, at the faces of people who were looking to him for guidance. "I think," Charles began, his voice barely a whisper, "I think we need to consider the doubt." There was a murmur of agreement. Jason smiled slightly, as if relieved to have an ally in the room. But Charles's heart was pounding in his chest. He had made his choice. The foreman called for a vote. One by one, the jurors cast their ballots. The air was thick with tension, every second dragging on for an eternity. When it came to Charles, his hand trembled as he marked his choice. Not guilty. The final vote was tallied. The verdict was clear. The foreman stood, and the jury was called back into the courtroom. As they filed in, Charles could feel his pulse quicken. He glanced at Paul Avery, sitting at the defense table. Avery's expression was unreadable, but his eyes flickered with a hint of hope. The judge asked the foreman for the jury's decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Avery's defense attorney breathed a sigh of relief, while the prosecutor's face hardened. Avery's eyes filled with tears as he realized his ordeal was over. He was free. But for Charles, the nightmare was just beginning. What price will Charles pay for defying the threat? The suspense reaches its peak in the thrilling conclusion of the jury's dilemma. The end.